Erika will give this a few minutes because, or 1 minute before I start introducing you slowly, because it takes a little bit of time for the attendees to come in.
But I should share my screen to present my slides, right?
Yeah, exactly. You can share. Well, I think Mandy will let you do that. Or I think you can do that already. Mandy, we can do that?
Yep, after you've done your introduction, I'll turn my screen off, and then Erika can turn her screen share on.
Great, okay. And I'll see people are coming in. So welcome, everybody. It is good to have you back. For those of you who have joined us in the past, or for those of you for whom this is a new adventure, welcome. So this is the start of a new series of what started as the VDEV seminar and then became the VDEV CPR, and now is the VDEV CPR BREAD seminar in development economics. Excited to start off a new season, or a new year, in fact, where we'll continue to have every 2 weeks a presentation by a development economist, and very happy in particular to start off today with Erika Field from Duke University, who will be sharing her work on child marriage in Bangladesh. Very, very interesting and very exciting, that I'm sure you'll all enjoy. Before getting to there, a little bit of the rules of the game for those of you who are new, or for those of you who don't remember, it's been a few months. I will, for the first hour, Erika will present, and you can, any questions that you can have, you can type in the Q&A. We will keep track of those questions, and at certain intervals, interrupt Erika with some of the questions that are being raised. Now, if we don't get to your question, don't be upset. You know, sometimes we can't get to all of them, but also because after the hour, there will be an opportunity to then, we'll then open the floor, and so you can raise your hand and ask questions directly to Erika at that point live. So in the meantime, you'll be muted, but we will keep an eye on the Q&A as we indicated. The seminar is being recorded. It will be posted on the CPR websites with links to the BREAD website, etc., where the presentation will be available for a few weeks, so that if there is people from other time zones or other people that may not have been able to come this particular hour, you can, and that you think may be interested in hearing Erika's talk, feel free to flag this to them. Obviously, abuse in the seminar will not be tolerated. I think that's probably all in terms of housekeeping rules. So again, very happy, Erika, to have you with us. Thanks for taking this on, for starting this off. You know, it's hard after the summer, and so very excited to have you with us and to start with you this new year. Floor to you.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you to all who are hosting this wonderful seminar. I'm going to share my screen. There we go. So today I'm going to present joint work with Nina Buchmann and Rachel Glennerster, Shahana Nazneen, and Xiao Wang. And the topic of our study is child marriage. Sorry, my screen is, I'm having trouble advancing. There we go. So as motivation, it's a fairly easy topic to motivate. For those of you who don't know, there's still a huge number of child marriages that take place worldwide. An estimated 700 million women alive today were married under the age of 18. And Bangladesh, the setting of our study, has one of the highest rates of child marriage in the world, especially for very underage girls. So girls under the age of 15, the rate of child marriage is 39% among women who are currently 20 to 49. And this is especially an interesting case because this is in spite of demographic trends within Bangladesh over the past 2 decades that are expected to exert negative pressure on the demand for young brides. In particular, you see huge gains in girls' primary and secondary schooling. Women's labor force participation has risen quite steadily over the period, and fertility has fallen. And at the same time, there have been changing public attitudes towards underage marriage. That is, there is much less tolerance or stated tolerance for underage marriage in survey data. Most people say not only do they want young women say they want to be an adult bride, or they want their daughters to marry over the age of 18. They also express a preference for their sons marrying women who are over the age of 18. And so this poses a really interesting question of why we see persistent rates of child marriage in spite of these trends. And here is a visual representation of these trends as seen in the Demographic and Health Survey of Bangladesh over the past several rounds. And you can see here just very clearly that most of the lines, which reflect female literacy and primary school completion, child mortality, and secondary school completion, are rising steadily between 2004 and 2017, yet the rate of marriage under the age of 18, which is the blue line on the top of this figure, is fairly steady. You see some declines at the beginning of this period, but certainly over the past 10, 15 years, it's remained high and steady. The other motivation is that there have been several policy approaches to reducing child marriage in many settings, including Bangladesh, that have all proven fairly ineffective. First of all, there are age of consent laws prohibiting child marriage in nearly every country in the world right now, and empirical studies of the impact of these laws has shown very little change in developing countries. Girls' schooling programs, that is any kind of program that promotes girls' schooling attainment at the secondary school level, such as scholarship programs, have shown to have small effects on the rate of child marriage, often because they're tied to a conditionality that restricts girls from marrying while they're in secondary school. But clearly these have limited potential effect on especially the most vulnerable girls, because they're only impactful for girls who are attending secondary school. And I would say the modal policy approach to reducing child marriage at this point in time are a suite of programs that fall under the umbrella term of girls' empowerment programs. And these are bundles of trainings that target adolescent girls and try to empower them by teaching them about legal rights and negotiation skills, some livelihoods training, and financial training. And these have taken place in many parts of the world, but have shown to have very little effect on marriage age. They do tend to empower girls in terms of knowledge accumulation and aspirations, but do not seem to impact age of marriage. And so in this paper, what we do is formalize one potential reason that child marriage might persist even when the preference for young brides dies out. And that is a signaling story. And in particular, signaling considerations have the potential to influence girls' choice over marriage age in any given setting, as long as the bride characteristic that dominates in the marriage market, the most preferred bride type in a given setting, is first of all not perfectly observed by potential mates in the marriage market. And secondly, that this characteristic is negatively correlated with the returns to education. So that is, whatever the bride type is and bride education are substitutes in the marriage market. If these two conditions hold, we show in our applied theory model, you will see potential signaling considerations that would exert negative pressure on age of marriage. And what we argue is that in many settings, but particularly in South Asia, in Bangladesh, where we investigate this question, both conditions are very likely to hold because the dominant bride characteristic in the marriage market is widely believed to be women's adherence to traditional gender norms. And these include gender norms of obedience to husbands and in-laws, or docility, one might call it, social conservatism more generally, and any kind of adherence to norms of behavior that protect a family's reputation. If this is the characteristic that is most important for girls to possess when they're considered for marriage, then you could have signaling considerations influencing marriage timing. These are data from data from survey data that we gathered in rural Bangladesh, in which we simply asked husbands of girls in our study what were the most important characteristics of brides at the point of marriage. And you can see of course, it's imprecise to kind of try to classify this very rigorously, but it is the case that the most frequently mentioned characteristic is something related to a girl's social conservatism. So reputation, how traditional she is, her overall nature. In contrast, a girl's age almost never comes up as a criteria for marriage. Now, part of this may be that most girls enter the marriage market fairly young in this setting, but it doesn't appear to be an important consideration for grooms that a girl be 17 and not 19, for instance. Oh, sorry, let me move. Now, the two key premises of the model are more particular than this. So this bride characteristic that's dominant in the market need be imperfectly observed by potential grooms. We argue that that is very likely to be the case here, or we have empirical evidence that that's the case. We investigate that empirically by constructing an index of social conservatism from survey data that we collect, which are baseline responses to 18 questions asked of unmarried girls about their adherence to gender norms. And these are items such as, how important is it that a girl be less educated than her husband? We have a variety of questions about gender norms. And what we see are two things. First of all, there is wide variation within this relatively close geographic area in terms of girls' type, in terms of adherence to gender norms. So there are girls who express relatively progressive gender norms alongside girls who are quite traditional in terms of what they believe to be the appropriate gender norms. And it's also the case, which I think is even more compelling, that girls' preferences or girls' adherence to gender norms differ substantially from that of their siblings and parents. And so it's not adherence to gender norms is not a household characteristic. That's important because that makes it certainly much less perfectly observed in a marriage market. That is, you can't infer something about a girl's adherence to gender norms by observing behavior of her siblings or parents. As an example, one question we asked was whether adolescent girls or women should be allowed to wear whatever they want. And this is one that divides our sample of girls perfectly. So half of them say yes, half of them say no. And the responses differ across sisters in the same family, 38% of the time. So there's a lot of variation whether or not girls think that's an important norm to adhere to. Another gender norm is whether it's okay for daughters to discuss marriage with their parents. In traditional families, parents kind of announce marriage to adolescent girls. In more progressive families, girls discuss their marriage, their future marriage plans with their parents before marriage. And this, again, kind of divides girls. 40% say yes, 60% say no, and this differs across sisters 1/3 of the time. The second premise of the model is that this characteristic, adherence to traditional gender norms, need be negatively correlated with the marriage market returns to education. You can think of this as the labor market returns to education, or just whatever the returns to education outside of the labor market might be. We think this is very likely to be true, first of all, because labor market participation varies strongly with adherence to gender norms. That is, women who express traditional gender norms are much less likely to participate in the labor market. And that's also the case of participation in any kind of household decision-making, which is strongly negatively correlated with stated conservatism. And finally, we just think it's reasonable in a market where female education is positively valued, and we have empirical evidence and anecdotal evidence of that, it's reasonable to assume that these two bride types act as substitutes, that these are substitute characteristics. The implications of these two features of the marriage market, introducing signaling concerns in the market, are that it introduces the possibility that all women marry young or feel pressure to marry young to either reveal their type as a preferred type or to hide their type, even if all men and all women in the market prefer that women delay marriage. And so you could, what we describe in our model is the case of a pooling equilibrium in which everyone pools on young marriage. And what this implies is that you could have a setting in which child marriage rates remain inefficiently high and also sticky. That is, when there are demographic trends that put pressure on, that reduce the demand for youth or increase the demand for older bride, you might have marriage rates staying young. It also means that any policy that reduces child marriage under these conditions is potentially Pareto improving. And finally, what we show in the paper and test empirically is that it implies that a small incentive has the potential to induce all women to marry later. What we're going to show is that the incentive, the financial incentive in the case of our study, doesn't have to be offered to everyone, because you can capitalize on market level spillovers in the shift towards later marriage. So if you can induce some women to marry later, and there's a signaling story going on, you can induce other women who are not receiving the incentive to marry later. And that contrasts sharply with a prediction on a policy to incentivize later marriage. If the marriage market pattern is based on a simple preference for young brides, a society-wide demand for youth in the marriage market, then you would need a major intervention to compensate for the increase in dowry or the disutility of marrying later. And finally, a signaling model, if signaling is an important part of the reason why we are seeing high rates of child marriage, it means that any intervention, such as the standard empowerment program, anything that increases the distribution of types in the market, and that's exactly what empowerment programs are kind of designed to do, is to shift girls away from adherence to traditional gender norms. That actually has the potential to have a perverse effect on early marriage rates. And that is because the signaling value, the value of signaling that you're not a preferred type, increases as that type becomes more rare in the market. And so you could empower women quite a bit, and then have the signaling story becomes even more important. And so that could have exert negative pressure as opposed to positive pressure on marriage age. So we test this model empirically with a large-scale field experiment that we conducted across 468 villages in rural Bangladesh. In these villages, we introduced, randomized across villages, 2 alternative early marriage programs. And the first was a relatively novel conditional incentive program in which families were compensated periodically for keeping their daughters unmarried as long as the daughters were under the legal age of marriage, so between ages 15 and 18. And the only conditionality to receive these benefits was that the girl remain unmarried. And then in another set of villages, we introduced a pretty standard empowerment curriculum that was designed to discourage traditional norms of behavior among adolescent girls. Again, a bundle of trainings that encouraged labor supply, encouraged women to negotiate with their parents and learn about their rights, etc. To give you a preview of the findings, what we see after tracking girls well into marriage ages was that the financial incentive produced marriage for treated girls who were eligible for the incentive, but also among untreated girls in their communities, and by quite a bit. So there was a 20% reduction in underage marriage among girls eligible for the incentive. And there was also a 10 to 11% reduction in underage marriage among girls not eligible for the incentive, but who lived close to incentive villages. And importantly, these spillovers, these market level spillovers, were only observed among the non-preferred types. And that's a very distinct prediction of our model, that you should get this kind of free riding behavior among girls who themselves want to delay marriage because they are the high education types innately. Meanwhile, dowry and husband quality remain unchanged, which is, again, is important evidence that it's not simply compensating people for something they don't want to do. If you have to pay people to do something that they'd rather not do, then you should see the market price go up of marrying girls later. And that's exactly why you should be required to compensate people for doing that. But in fact, dowry stays the same despite this financial incentive, which is more suggestive or more consistent with a signaling style model. Meanwhile, the empowerment program did manage to change types. That is, you see girls in these villages adopting more progressive gender norms, but it failed to reduce rates of underage marriage. And we see dowry increasing significantly while husband quality stays constant, which suggests that girls are kind of worse off by being more empowered in terms of marriage market outcomes. Okay, and we interpret these patterns as evidence that the signaling environment in this setting is exacerbating child marriage and making the empowerment program less likely to work here. But it does increase the potential for a relatively small financial incentive to have a large effect on reducing child marriage.
Erika, let me interrupt here with a few questions. The first is a simple one, but an important one to clarify, I think, from Sylvie Lambert on the role of virginity in the sort of preferences for virginity. And so is that an alternative story that you know, men may say they prefer late ages, but they have a stronger preference for virginity. So how do you, so that's kind of one, go ahead, maybe I'll let you answer.
Yeah, let me be clear that we're basically going to test our predictions alongside predictions for an alternative model, which we call preference for youth. And that could come from, you know, a variety of different reasons why society might prefer youth. One could be because virginity preference. I mean, obviously that falls monotonically with age. It could be because people believe that fertility is higher if you marry earlier, which I think traditionally people did. I could say something about that from kind of focus group work and some data we've collected on this, but right now we're just going to group that all in terms of demand for youth. And that's a model in which you have to compensate people for marrying later, and that people actually prefer younger brides. What we're going to claim here is that I did say people do say they don't prefer younger brides or don't prefer to be younger brides. They could, of course, be just giving the response that they think people want to hear. And that's, you know, I think what Sylvia is suggesting. But we're going to rule that out because the response to a financial incentive gives rise to different predictions under that model. And so that we're going to rule it out indirectly.
And then a bit related, there's a question on are we thinking of the main decision makers being the parents or the children? So when you talk about preferences for, you know, early versus late marriage, is that of the younger generation or the older generation or both? And
I think the correct model here is always the parents. And I'll say a little bit more about that, I think, on the next slide. I think on this slide, actually, I'll say something about that. But okay. We're thinking of the parents. This is a nearly universal system of arranged marriage. So parents are always negotiating the marriage contract from parent to parent, from parents to in-laws.
Okay, and so
should I keep going, Karen, or is there
one final question which is related from Farah Sad, which lots of people want to know the answer to, so let me ask it. Whether could the parents have promised or engaged underage, sorry, that was too quick, Gianmarco. Just like, could they have promised or engaged underage girls, delaying the actual marriage, but essentially locking in the match? So you have the signal, but then you don't act on it.
So that doesn't happen systematically before the onset of puberty in the setting. It's kind of not culturally accepted to do that. So in some societies, you have people negotiating marriages when kids are, you know, before they're born, or when they're, you know, as soon as they're very, very young. This is one version of traditional Islam. It's a little bit specific in Bangladesh, but where it's not considered acceptable to make marriage arrangements before puberty. You could have long engagement, as I think. You know, part of what the question is. And so one thing we could be doing is that there could be marriages being arranged, but then we just delay when it actually happens. And we think, you know, I don't think we can rule that out. I think the benefits of remaining unmarried, though, still accrue to the girl if she's not actually moving into her in-laws' house. And so in particular, girls can continue going to school if they're still living with their parents. And so whether or not it's, you know, informally arranged or actually officially engaged, even if she's married and doesn't move in, which can also happen sometimes. Sometimes marriage happens and then girls stay with their parents and don't move in with their in-laws for a few months. And so we can't fully rule that out, but we also think that doesn't matter. I think that, yeah, again, the benefits of remaining unmarried are really about staying with your parents.
Yeah. Wait, I'll let you continue.
Okay, so we're in this setting, girls and we believe boys have very little agency in marriage decisions. This is a parent-to-parent negotiation. And in fact, what is kind of unique here, but a bit tangential to our predictions, is that most marriages are arranged through a third party, through professional matchmakers, who also negotiate the contract terms. And there's a pretty thick market for matchmaking. The average village has 3 matchmakers. People can seek matchmakers in other villages. It's also a setting of patrilocal exogamy, which is, I think, very important for the predictions, some of the predictions on observability. So unlike many Islamic societies, households here are practicing exogamy, in which daughters move into households in villages that are far away from their natal village. And so they're not marrying in extended families, they're not marrying even locally. It's not the preferred marriage. Most marriages involve a dowry. In our data, 85% of marriages have a pre-negotiated dowry. And that is a payment from the wife's family to the groom's family. And the dowries are high. So this is a very significant fraction of a household's wealth goes towards that one-time marriage payment. And also what's unique to Bangladesh is that marriage contracts entail a pre-negotiated prenuptial amount, which is the amount that a groom pays in the event of divorce. The average rate of child marriage in our particular setting is high. It's not the highest in Bangladesh, but at baseline, 52% of girls are marrying under 18 and 26% under 16. So we're trying, as I said just a minute ago, we're essentially trying to distinguish between 2 categories of origins of early marriage. One is any kind of preference for early marriage, any kind of cultural preference for child marriage, what we're going to call a youth premium in the marriage market, versus signaling and reputation concerns. That is something related to men believing that women who delay marriage are somehow undesirable. We first look at survey data. What can we learn about these 2 categories of origins of early marriage from survey data? It's true that parents often cite one reason you shouldn't delay marriage because there's a risk of bad reputation. So there's some, survey evidence that signaling considerations come up. There's also no, as I said before, there's no stated preference in any of the data we've collected or other survey data that people have collected on ideal marriage age. We asked about what's the minimum age a girl should get, what's the minimum acceptable age of marriage, what's the maximum acceptable age of marriage, what are the reasons a girl shouldn't marry below that, what are the reasons she shouldn't marry above that. We asked that of parents and of girls and of parents about the bride that their son takes. Now, and they kind of consistently say what they've kind of been told by policymakers, I guess, over the past couple decades, that underage marriage is bad for girls. It's, education is good for girls. It's better for fertility if girls wait longer. There's a risk of early age childbearing in terms of child mortality and maternal mortality. People seem aware of these things, and they, spit it back at least. Whether or not it's true, you might wonder. One way that people try to infer whether there's a youth premium in the marriage market is using data on dowry and correlating it with marriage age to see whether there's a positive slope. In fact, there is a pretty steady positive slope. Right now, I've taken the data across cohorts of girls and to see what the trend in the youth premium is. And here you can see that it's pretty steady over the last 3 cohorts. That is the top 3 lines. The slope is almost identical. Of course, it's not really fair to interpret all of this as a youth premium since we have selection into marriage age, and it could just be that wealthier girls are marrying later. We try to say something more precise in our survey on the youth premium by interviewing matchmakers and asking them to answer hypothetical vignette questions. And that this exercise, in a nutshell, is to take a vignette, which is a description of 2 people that are getting married, who come to them to negotiate the marriage contract, and ask what happens if Saida waits a year to marry, and if she marries at 16, what if she waits and marries the same guy at 17, at 18? And here the idea is to try to hold everything about the couple constant and just change this one thing about the marriage match and see what that does to the dowry and the negotiated prenuptial agreement. That's what's presented on the left side of this figure. The dowry is the blue bar, and you can see that as I think it was Saida in this case, as she enters the marriage market a little bit later, her dowry does go steadily up. What makes this a little uninterpretable as a youth premium is that it's a little harder to see, but the red bar is the prenuptial amount, and that's going up almost equally as steadily. And so one interpretation of that is that as girls enter the market at older ages, they purchase more insurance against divorce. And it's hard to separate that from having to pay more because they're older. In contrast, if you ask the same kind of vignette question about a girl's education, so suppose Saida is a little bit more educated. She got through more school by this age. She was faster. She passed grade 8. You see that both the dowry falls as the girl gets more educated, the same girl, and the prenuptial amount goes up. So that's unambiguously positively valued on the marriage market. If you're more educated, holding everything else constant, your marriage terms are unambiguously better in both dimensions. So it's hard to know if there's a youth premium on the marriage market. There's not an unambiguous one for sure. So we need more nuanced predictions, and so that's what we argue is motivation for our field experiment in order to test between these two models of the origins of child marriage. Okay, so our simple model of the marriage market, it's very stylized, but it's designed just to derive these unique sets of predictions. We essentially think about a marriage market in which brides are choosing between early marriage and late marriage. And we assume they go to school until they marry. And so that means that early marriage always implies lower education. Based on the last data, really motivated by the last data, we assume that bride education is valued on the marriage market by everyone. But it's not the dominant marriage market characteristic. So the dominant bride characteristic is social conservatism. Girls are essentially deciding whether to exit the market in T1, in which, so an unmarried woman who's either a preferred or unpreferred type can enter the marriage market with low education. That is, if she marries at that point, she gets low education. Men make the dowry offer to these women, and a woman receives an offer, accepts it, pays the dowry, and exits. And then in T2, the remaining unmarried women can declare availability for marriage or not, or they can remain unmarried. Unmarried men make dowry offers to these women, and then if a woman accepts it, she gets married and exits or remains unmarried. And what we show is that we can get a possibility of pooling on early marriage at baseline, and that's essentially because men are going to believe that the later entrants are the low type for sure under these conditions, and that's because they have higher marginal returns from education. And so because submissiveness is first order in marriage, a man is going to charge a much higher dowry if he knows that she's a low type for sure, even though he benefits from her higher education, or he gets utility from her higher education, he's still going to charge a higher dowry. And that means that you could have, given certain parameter values, you could have the low types preferring to pool with the high on early marriage and low education, to deviating from that and revealing themselves to be a low type. And this could be true even if everyone, again, would benefit from delaying, from women marrying later. We're assuming that we're shutting down the possibility of a screening menu. And I think that's justifiable here as long as there's some liquidity constraint that prevents that. That is, low types simply cannot afford that. Then you would have no screening menu possible. The insights from this kind of, if we're in a low marriage pooling equilibrium, what that means is that a small conditional transfer, as long as it's random and not perfectly observed, has the potential to lead treated and then also some untreated women to delay marriage. And that's because men will know that everyone, high and low type women, now have an extra incentive to marry later. As long as treatments that whether or not you're eligible for the incentive is orthogonal to your type. So in the status quo, the only reason that women don't delay is because that would signal that they're a low type for sure. And now there's some ambiguity about what their motives for delaying are. And depending, that could be enough to obscure type enough that you shift from a low marriage age pooling equilibrium to a high marriage age. The reasons, again, that the transfer doesn't have to be large is because, essentially because there's this benefit of higher education in our model. So you don't have to compensate people because people are getting that benefit in addition. The testable predictions, when we think about our field experiment, is that a sufficiently large conditional incentive to delay marriage is going to delay marriage timing and increase education among treated women of all types. And then we should expect to see spillovers among untreated low types. We should expect to see them also delaying, as long as it's not perfectly observed whether or not they're eligible for the incentive. The untreated high types would still marry early. As if you're a high type, that is a low returns to education type, and you're not getting the incentive, we should expect to see you still exiting the market early to reveal your type. And one important thing to note is that the conditional transfer is not enabling a separating equilibrium. The transfer doesn't ease the liquidity constraint for the treatant, and that's because it's offered to both the high and the low types. So that's not how this is working. Other testable predictions from our model that we bring to the data are that treated women should pay weekly smaller dowry and not have lower quality marriages than untreated women. And the other testable prediction from the empowerment program is that an exogenous change in the type distribution among girls should weekly decrease marriage age and education among all types of women. All right, well, let me tell you about the field experiment.
Erika, before you do that, a question on the model. There was a question from Garance Chenico earlier on whether on the pooled equilibrium. So she's wondering whether higher returns to education wouldn't make a separating equilibrium more likely.
If you changed returns to education, you're talking about a different.
Yeah, if there is, if you have a situation indeed where you have higher returns to education. Yeah.
By easing the liquidity constraint, I guess if the wealth shock were enough, or something that increases the returns to education, and there aren't borrowing constraints, I guess that could also induce a separate equilibrium. I think that's not going to be part of the predictions of any of our intervention, since we're not. If our conditional incentive were large enough, that might be something you'd have to worry about. We argue that it's not. But yeah.
And then there's a question from earlier, but I think your results probably allow you to rule it out, but let me ask it anyway, which is, so there's a question on whether rather than a signal, kind of the early marriage may also mean that the bride is still more malleable, and so that you can make the bride more docile by having an early age of marriage. So in that sense, it's endogenous. It's not a fixed threat, it's an endogenous outcome of early marriage.
Yeah, so all of our type classification comes from baseline data before girls are married. And so I do think that person is correct, and that is one of the motivations for early marriage that people have stated in other settings, is that girls are more docile and more malleable and remain that way even when they're older if they're married young. And so that's part of the youth preference. I mean, that's another reason that I think is one of the most compelling for why people might actually prefer to marry young brides. But I think that that can be ruled out in the same way we're ruling out that entire category of preferences.
Yeah.
In terms of measurement, the endogeneity is a problem. If you measured adult women, it'd be hard. You wouldn't be able to classify them.
Yeah, great. I'll let you continue.
Okay, so we conduct a field experiment, as I said, in 468 villages in 3 sub-districts of southwestern Bangladesh in the Borishal region of Bangladesh. And villages were randomized to receive either the empowerment program, the incentive program, or both programs, or a pure control. And we stratified it at the union level. Villages are clustered into an administrative level called a union, just to achieve maximum balance. The incentive program targeted girls ages 15 to 17 at program start who were unmarried. They were eligible to receive 3 times a year a transfer of 4 liters of cooking oil, which is a highly liquid in more ways than one good in this market. Households are consuming much more oil than that in each household per year. And it's also something that's fungible in the market easily. As I said, the only condition is that the girl remain unmarried. And the most challenging part of this is monitoring marriage in a way that such that girls aren't able to lie about their marital status. But that was actually the marriage practice of exogamy helps a lot, because our main check, we did a number of checks on marital status throughout the program. But the easiest thing to do was unannounced visits to the parents' house. And as long as the daughter showed up 3 times with an unannounced visit, we assumed that she was, and said she was unmarried. Again, I think that's pretty good evidence that she is. This is a picture of girls receiving at the central location in the middle of the village. Every 4 months, girls brought their distribution ID with them, which we issued at the start of the program, and that was taken away when a marriage took place. We also, community health workers kept track of marital status, and we interviewed village officials about marriages that had taken place, checked marriage registrars for marriages that had been registered in the area, and then again asked neighbors and family members about marriages, and audited and checked that the girl was at home. The empowerment program was something that took place. It was relatively intensive, so it lasted for 6 months, and between 15 and 25 girls met on a 6 days per week for 1.5 hours after school in a central location in the village that was deemed a safe space by the community at the start of the program. Each day, girls, there was a very set curriculum throughout the 6-month period, and girls were trained on a number of different subjects that was taken from the standard BRAC empowerment curriculum, which has now been implemented in many different parts of the world. This is a picture of a safe space in operation, and it was something that take-up was very high of both programs. The financial incentive for obvious reasons, but there was no kind of stigma to participation in that. And the empowerment program, I think, the girls were thrilled to have this kind of engagement and this kind of opportunity to meet with each other and be trained after school. And so the hardest part was community sensitization stage, introducing the program and getting the community leaders on board. Was a bit of a challenge, but the girls themselves showed up quite readily. We evaluated these programs with a baseline before the either program started, which included both all of our waves of surveying included a census of all girls in the study villages. And that was a very simple asking parents about marital status, about fertility of married girls, about schooling of girls. And then we also conducted alongside an in-depth survey of a random sample of 20 girls in each household, in which we asked hours and hours of questions of the girl and her parents, and tracked those girls once they were married to alternative locations. And so the census becomes much more feasible just because parents don't really move at this stage of life. It was very easy to find the parents from round around in the same village. Tracking girls across rural Bangladesh was quite labor intensive and expensive for that reason, but we put a lot of effort into tracking. But we always kept the census data going for power and cost efficacy. We tracked them right a year after the program ended in 2011, and then again in 2016 and 17. And I'm going to show you data from the census results. As I said before, program take-up was high. Empowerment enrollment was 85% to 90%. I'm showing separately in the empowerment-only villages versus the villages that receive both programs. And the incentive take-up was also high, maybe lower than one might expect. It was 90% on average. And I think the only reason people wouldn't take up the incentive, there might have been some missing cards, but I think families travel periodically or migrate for various household events, and so sometimes the girls weren't there. But almost everyone took up the oil when they were eligible. Yeah, we tracked all girls by asking their parents about everyone who was in their household. And we had attrition, largely because of kind of data entry errors that made it difficult to match data across rounds. We also had some attrition that due to cyclone damage that washed out entire villages mainly. Luckily, that was for statistical purposes, that tended to be concentrated in entire villages. And then we had some dropout after girls were enrolled in the program, some married before the start of the program, but those are easy to identify. Overall, attrition was balanced across treatment arm, and when you take into account cyclone damage, it's around 12% across the entire sample. We have very straightforward experimental estimates that compare outcomes of girls assigned to the 4 different treatment arms. Just to give you some sense of what's going on in the background in these communities, by the time of the follow-up in 2000, the second wave follow-up, 86% of girls are married at that point, which was a little bit lower than we anticipated, but still fairly high. 40% of girls in the control group married underage, so it seems to be improving in the control group relative to what we found at baseline, and 16% married under 16. Let me go ahead and show you the results since I'm running out of time. First, if we look at the empowerment program, this is a regression in which we have this index of social conservatism, and we measure it before and after the program, and find evidence of a significant change in attitudes, expressed preferences and beliefs of the empowerment program. It's not huge in terms of standard deviation terms, but it is concentrated among those who participated in the empowerment program and doesn't appear to be changed by the existence of the incentive program. It's also it's not surprising. I mean, girls are trained on these topics, and then there could be obviously very strong response bias. If we look at marriage outcomes, what we see, this is a lot of numbers on this crowded table, but the patterns are very consistent, so I'll summarize them for you. The first row is the impact on marriage age and marriage timing of the empowerment program, the second of participation in the incentive program, and the third of an interaction between the two, if there's any additional effect of receiving both programs. And what we see is essentially null results across the board on the first row. So the empowerment program kind of does nothing to marriage timing or birth timing as a consequence of marriage timing. Whereas the incentive program pretty consistently reduces underage marriage or increases marriage age. You can see in the first column, what I've done, each outcome is in the first heading of the table. And then underneath are 2 separate samples. One is all girls 15 to 17, and one is just the sample of girls who received the programs for 2 full years. The predicted program effects are much different when you consider these 2 samples, just because girls who are 17 at the start of the program have very little scope to change their marriage because they receive so little of the program. And so we tend to get bigger effects when we look at girls who are participating from age 15 on, but it's a smaller sample. So what we see in kind of columns 1 and 2 is in this 20% reduction in the rate of underage marriage. So the rates here are between 30 and 38%. You'll notice that the control means across the 2 samples are significantly different, and that's just mechanical because to participate in the program, you had to be unmarried at 17. And so rates of underage marriage are going to be significantly lower for the 15 to 17 sample than the 15 sample. But again, the second row of this table across the board suggests strong, significant reductions in marriage age from receiving an incentive, and no additional interaction effect of the incentive plus the empowerment. This is a picture of those effects. This is the distribution of marriage age across the 4 experimental arms, and you can see essentially that those assigned to the incentive or the incentive plus empowerment, the yellow and the green, are kind of on top of each other and shifted to the right relative to the control or the empowerment, that are pretty much on top of each other. What's interesting here that is surprising and kind of outside the scope of our model's predictions is that the incentive seems to have an effect beyond the life of the program. So you don't receive the incentive after age 18, and yet your marriage age appears to be shifted forward even at ages 20 and 21 and 22. I think there are some logical explanations for that, but we don't know exactly why that is. but search frictions would be an obvious candidate. Education outcomes, as the model predicts, there's a fairly mechanical relationship between education and marriage age. Girls do often stay in school until they're married, or close until they're entering the marriage market. That might be a little bit unique to Bangladesh because schooling is essentially free for girls and over the period of this study. Girls aren't working much in terms of labor market participation. There's home production, but they're getting actually a scholarship for participating in secondary school from the government. And so that would compensate for any loss of income in the girls for continuing in school, and there's no tuition. And so girls tend to stay in school as long as they can pass. But that means there's this important additional benefit of postponing marriage age. If we look at the marriage market effects of participation in the program, we see the results that I referred to early on in the presentation, which is that we look at just the dowry, we see kind of no significant change in dowry from participation in the incentive program, but statistically significant increase among those in empowerment villages. It is important to note that the coefficient estimates on those two treatment arms are not statistically distinguishable. But no change in husband quality, measurable quality in either treatment arm. We don't have really rich data on husband quality, and that's because these data come from the census of parents. And so these are not the husband's parents, these are the daughter's parents. But we expect them to be able to answer basic questions like his education, his age, whether or not he earns income at that point in time. And then the last two columns look at where he comes from. And we did that because there are predictions from this model in terms of marrying someone close or far, but they're actually relatively complex. We looked at the distance from the native village of the husband more because traditionally rooms from further away are considered more desirable. And so we saw it as kind of a measure of quality. But there's no change in any indicator of quality that we have. The next table looks at spillover effects. And so what we have here is a sample of girls who live on the edge of incentive villages, but they themselves are not eligible for the incentive. In fact, so think about this. This is rural Bangladesh, but the population density is fairly uniform. It's fairly dense relative to a lot of rural settings, in that it's kind of village after village after village. And the villages, these are agricultural households. They're spread out, but there's kind of a continuous population of villages. And so the first thing we did in conducting this study was to map the village boundaries and create discrete village populations. We did that with the village leaders, literally drew maps and kind of placed households in each village. But there's a lot of ambiguity about which household belongs in which village. And we saw that front and center when we introduced the programs, because especially the incentive program, there were a lot of households that kind of argued with us, like, but I'm in that village, why can't my daughter participate? We had to stick to the original boundaries. We issued cards if you're in an incentive program. But my point is that there is a lot of ambiguity about who pertains to what village. And that's kind of important for the predictions of our model, because what we're saying is that there's going to be some marriage market ambiguity about whether or not this girl who lives in this house was eligible for this incentive. What that's going to do, that ambiguity is going to allow that girl to, it's going to give some ambiguity about the girl's motivations for delaying marriage. Again, if everyone knows she's not eligible for an incentive, if she delays, then she's obviously a low type. If she's potentially eligible for the incentive, then there's some noise about what it means that she delayed. And so we're taking that prediction very literally, considering the girls that are within a kilometer, so very close to the center of the incentive village, but they themselves are not inside the village boundary. So they're on the edge of the village. That's close to the incentive village. And we are looking for program effects on those girls. And you can see that there are program effects among girls ages 15 to 17 who live on the edge of incentive villages. So they don't get any money, but they still delay. we think this is not a simple kind of peer effect spillover, because if you look at the next cohort of girls who are younger, you don't see that happening among younger girls. That's just happening among this one cohort of girls. And what's even more compelling is that if you take the data on types, that we've classified girls as high types or low types according to their baseline survey data on gender norms, we have to turn to the subsample at that point. So the sample size drops dramatically. But we can see that the reduction in marriage age, the reduction in underage marriage, is entirely concentrated among girls who are the low types. So girls who are the high returns to education girls. And that's in column 3. And so the girls who live close to incentive villages but are conservative types actually don't delay at all. Okay. So
Erika, I'll let you conclude, but let me in the meantime remind people that in a few minutes after the conclusions, we'll open the mic. So if you have a question you want to ask live, you can raise your hand already, and then we'll be able to select from that. Go ahead, Erika.
So the last section of the paper just considers what these results imply for policy scale up and optimal policy design. I won't go into the details of that exercise, but essentially this, you can consider variation in the optimal coverage of the marriage program and the size of the transfer. The randomness and observability might vary because of the way in which you implement the program. But essentially, we argue that the optimal policy is to exploit spillovers as much as you can rather than pay everyone. And you can use that to characterize the optimal transfer and coverage, accounting for the cost of the transfers. What we argue is that greater coverage, smaller transfer is the most cost effective under most assumptions, and best leverages spillovers. And so that's the takeaway of that is that offering kind of a token transfer to almost everyone with some ambiguity will capitalize on the spillovers and leverage spillovers in the maximal way. Let me just conclude since I'm out of time before going into detail there. I think what we learned from this paper is that we demonstrate that it's possible that the signaling environment contributes to both the levels and the trajectories of child marriage in a given setting. And we think that our empirical results support that is what is an important part of what's going on in this environment. Not only is child marriage likely to be inefficient in terms of welfare, but standard empowerment programs are unlikely to be effective if part of what is happening is that everyone is trying to kind of hide their type by exiting the market early. On the other hand, we think there's strong potential, and we think the field experiment results demonstrate strong potential for a kind of token financial incentive to have a very big effect in shifting the market towards a high marriage equilibrium. And in doing so, also increasing female schooling and reducing teenage pregnancies or teenage childbearing. So that wraps up my portion of this presentation, but I'm really excited to take questions from anyone.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Erika. Super fascinating. I think we'll start with a question from Garance. Who can unmute herself. Garance, you should be able, yeah, go ahead.
Yes, hi Erika, very interesting talk. I was wondering, it's tough without seeing the model to guess what happens, but how you avoid the separating equilibrium and why the monetary transfer, they also increase. So when I think about the reason there's a pooling is that essentially it's too cheap for the non-obedient type to give up education, and they prefer to mimic the high obedient type. But when it becomes more costly to signal like that you would switch to, you might switch to a separating equilibrium, and in some sense that would also result in a decrease in child marriage, because you start from a premise, I think, where everybody is pulling on that early age. And so once you have a separating equilibrium, it may not be everybody that switched to the late age, but you would have a decrease in child marriage. So I was a bit distracted thinking about why you think they switch to a pooling at a later age as opposed to allowing for separating.
I mean, I think if you could have that dynamic, you could have a shift from a low marriage equilibrium to a separating equilibrium. As you said, that would I think give rise to the same predictions. I'm trying to think about the types. I think you then see
just the very obedient type, the people who don't value too much education. Okay, they would stay with, you know, a small minority of people who would do early marriage. But
I think you're right. I mean, I think obviously it doesn't have the same potential. You know, not everybody is marrying late in our so empirically these things don't map perfectly, and so it makes it ambiguous. You know, it could be, I think, that you're moving from one to the other. Which does matter in terms of trying to say something about the potential effect of any program. Yes. But on the other hand, you know, it gives rise to the same, you know, result in that as long as there are enough types, depending on the type distribution, there's a lot of potential for these programs. I think the reason we ruled it out, we focused on the kind of simple, I mean, our justification for the not having a separating equilibrium at baseline in this setting is that there are important liquidity constraints, and that's based on the size of the dowry. Of course, the dowry differential depends on the relative marriage market returns to education versus submissiveness, and that's not something we can know exactly. But given the overall level, you know, size of the dowry and knowledge of, you know, real liquidity constraints, the fact that returns to education you're not going to realize those gains, you know, until several years later, and there are a lot of credit market imperfections that are going to prevent you from being able to equate those things. We decided it was realistic to assume that people are stuck without that possibility. If that's the case, then it's not obvious why you'd suddenly be able to shift to a separating equilibrium. I mean, without changing people's liquidity. And so I think it's not that would matter so much if that were what was going on. You know, if we did have introduced something or something in the background changed to allow that, it's just that it didn't kind of map to our premise, I guess, of the environment.
Yeah. So I guess you're saying, how much could the dowry increase if we knew you were obedient? Yeah.
We're assuming that's large enough that you're not going to, you know, it's not going to be a realistic consideration to borrow that much in anticipation of the future gains to education.
Erika, there was a question earlier before turning. Liana, I'll come to you, but just quickly, because this is a related question from Sylvie Lambert earlier, kind of how did the size of the transfer, do you know how the size of the transfer compares to the increase in dowry linked to marrying later?
Well, so we don't find an increase in dowry to marrying later, but you know, it depends on what you believe the increase in dowry to I mean, I could show you that correlation. And so actually the size of the transfer is, you know, more or less consistent with an average change in dowry with marriage age entrance. But again, we don't think that's causal. And so what we have to think about, the hypothetical change in dowry is like, you know, holding everything constant, how much more would someone have to pay? In a world in which in which you knew for sure that you were a low type. And I don't think we know that. But we actually did choose the amount of the transfer to map onto the estimated change in dowry in just a cross-section dowry marriage age. Well, like we were trying to think, you know, what do people kind of think is I guess the way to ask it, you kind of want to know what people assume is going to be the change in dowry that they would have to pay. But I don't think we know those levels.
Okay, great. Sylvie, I'll come to you, but first, Liana, because you're waiting. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you, Erika, for this presentation. It's very impressive field work and theory also. I can only imagine how hard it was to pull this off at the scale and across years. I had a bit of a quick clarifying question maybe, which is, maybe I missed this, but who makes the proposal of marriage? So is it the groom's parents or the bride's parents? Because I was just wondering whether you can say something on what happens to the other side of the market. So are men less likely to propose given common knowledge that maybe now women are less likely to accept? And is it possible for us to take kind of the evidence you found in the spillover villages as evidence that it is now the bride's parents who are rejecting offers? So I don't know if you have any measurements of the amount of marriage offers they get.
We don't. We have, a lot of data on all the marriage transactions that took place, and I'm thinking we haven't used those data if we have them, and I don't think we do. We did interview matchmakers, but I think we only asked them about actual matches and not prospective brides or grooms. The matchmakers are dealing with both, but traditionally the groom is making the offer to the bride. But in practice, I think it's a little more fluid than that, in the sense that if you have an eligible girl, you approach a matchmaker, you're in the database. And then, but traditionally the groom's family would approach you. But the negotiation, so it's a little ambiguous, I guess. But if brides' families are rejecting offers more, I think that could certainly happen. I guess that I guess there are a lot of considerations that may or may not be relevant to your concerns. I mean, one is that I think it wouldn't impact kind of grooms' availability of brides of a certain age, just because the market is expansive enough, given exogamy, that you could move into another village. You can find a pool of girls of a certain age, and so that kind of shouldn't affect the groom's marriage market prospects. And I think the story you had in mind of the groom offering, of the offer rate being lower.
The spillover fixes that, or at least proves.
That's my instinct, is that the type specific nature of the spillover, because I think we're assuming the grooms don't know the type. There are a lot of assumptions of it, and in which case we should not see that giving rise to that alone couldn't give rise to a differential spillover
proposal rates. Yeah.
But I'd have to think about that. But we also can't test it. I don't see that directly.
Yeah. Great. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Diana. Sylvie?
Hi. Thanks a lot, Erika, for this super interesting presentation and very convincing, I have to say. I'm just left with some questions about how it works in some details, because I don't see how the parents could have forecasted that the dowry was not going to increase if they married their child later due to this transfer. And in fact, because of the transfer, the girls stayed longer to school, and potentially spending 2 more years in secondary school doesn't make you more obedient, but rather less, or at least husbands could anticipate that. And so it was not clear from the parents' point of view that the dowry would not increase. That's a result ex post. But I'm not sure they could have anticipated it. So I'm surprised they actually took the bet to, take this transfer that is rather big, but not so big, and have the risk of this increase in the dowry because they marry their girls later. Yeah,
I mean, you do have to assume a certain level of sophistication. I'm trying to think about the best way to me, it's surprising also, but I think that this idea of an excuse, of a fear that, what does it mean if I marry, if my daughter marries late, she's going to be an obvious unwanted type. She's going to be. So one way I think these things happen is also kind of just observing people. As long as some people are kind of taking a chance, you're looking for signals for people around you. And once everyone starts leaving school and marrying, then it becomes more obvious that you're the outlier. You're the one who's still in school. You're the one who's standing out. So I do think these things can shift in a kind of hurting.
That explains the spillovers super well. I agree with that. That's exactly what I imagine that's what happens for the spillovers and the untreated. But the question is, why do the treated in the first place?
No, I'm talking about as long as some people have that instinct that, well, are sophisticated enough to say, now I have an excuse. Now it's not going to be, you just need a few parents. I'm arguing that you just need a few parents to have that instinct that, before, how would I explain keeping my daughter? But now, because of this big program, and it's a very salient program, they're getting paid to delay marriage. So they're in some sense just being kind of good citizens by doing what the law. You have to have some parents that are sophisticated, but I don't think you have to have all treated eligible parents that are sophisticated, because once you start observing that the sophisticated parents are keeping their daughters in school, and you can see that, that's also pretty salient, then I think it becomes more natural to you that it's not such a standout behavior to do the same. I mean, I think this is outside what we try to model, but to me it's intuitive that it's not obvious, and it might not happen for that reason, because it's too risky. No one would believe that it would matter in the marriage market. But as long as some people say, well, I have an excuse, it doesn't mean my daughter.
You have competition on the marriage market from girls who didn't benefit from that transfer, and are being married off very early. So I'm sorry, I don't want to keep the floor forever.
No. I mean, I think the stigma. So what's happening is the stigma is falling. We have a model. It's a stigma model, and so what we're saying is that when you take the stigma away from something, people respond immediately. You're giving a reason why that you can't take that for granted. But I do think that it was obvious enough to some people that the stigma is reduced when there's this program that's pushing you. When the government is pushing you to do something, when you do it, it's obviously there's an obvious excuse. And so I think that, to me, that's believable as potentially forecasting that there's going to be less stigma on the marriage market. It depends on how much of it, what the returns to education are to you or your. I mean, I could give you other reasons that are outside the scope of the model that I think parents also probably internalize the benefits of their daughter's education more than we're putting in the model. We're not allowing parents to have any utility from their daughters just being educated. But, in practice, I think parents really want that. So that would add, I guess, a level of adherence to this kind of, behavioral change in response to this kind of stigma reduction. But yeah, I think it's believable, but I take your point that it is not obvious that would happen, and I'd have to think about what are the characteristics of a community or a program that would make that most likely to happen, and that's not something we've thought through.
There's no more hands up. This question from Nino Doganazzi. I hope I didn't mispronounce too much your name. From earlier that I raised, because it's related to this. Unless, Nino, you want to ask the question yourself, or unless anybody else has another burning question. So what Nino was asking is, it's related to kind of the implications of the potential costs to the girls or to the parents, I guess, of delayed marriage. And so, one of the really cool things is that you have this longer term data. So the analysis you showed on the husband characteristics, I guess, speaks partly to this, but can you go one step further and kind of tell us a bit more, or even just your conclusion on what is it that you conclude on the costs of delaying marriage that your data suggests may or may not be there?
That's something we're actually in the field now trying to study more comprehensively. We waited a long time partly because of COVID, and we were going to go back into the field 2 years ago. Because we wanted to look at intergenerational benefits. So there are a lot of things that delayed marriage could help. And what we've seen so far that, or what I showed you today, are higher rates of education and lower rates of early pregnancy. What we're next interested in establishing are fertility. You could shift the timing of childbearing, but not fertility. We'll now have enough time to observe something more solid about fertility levels. Labor force participation, as women get more educated, what happens to labor force participation and participation in household decision making and kind of agency and empowerment. And we have a very selected group of married people, at the first wave, and so we can't say much about that. The second wave, we don't have, all the. Yeah, we haven't studied that, I guess, in depth, because we were waiting for the survey in which now everyone is kind of married and potentially working and potentially, has enough kids to say something solid about the benefits of delayed marriage. But that is certainly the next hope, that we can learn something more.
So Nino was in fact asking about the costs, but I guess the same data can tell you both. Like there may be certain costs for certain people.
The benefits of delaying or the costs of not delaying. Yeah.
Well, or the costs, is there a subset for whom there are costs because they don't get
the cost of delay?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think, well, if what we've, what we learned from the second wave is persists, then there's not a change in husband quality, but we'll, be able to test that more comprehensively with better data, and not data from parents. We're actually going, to everyone and interviewing their husbands too. Maybe I don't like to say this is a cost, but one, I think greater marital conflict is certainly something that whenever women have more agency or ability to participate or inclination to participate in household decisions, marital stability is somewhat at risk. And so we'll be able to say something more nuanced about that trade-off that societies face. I think intimate partner violence and marital conflict and marital stability are the main costs that we've thought about.
Okay, and so everybody should stay tuned for the next round of data and with results. We are out of time. Garima, I saw your hand up, but Erika will move to her Zoom room that Gianmarco shared in the chat. So anyone who has further questions can go there. And Erika, thanks so much for helping us start the year, but more importantly for this intriguing and fascinating but also important work. Glad to see you, at least virtually, and thanks for doing it. Take care.
Well, thank you for all the wonderful comments. That was very helpful.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks.